Almost heaven turned to hell, the sinister crimes of Jean Whitefeather and Donald Lance. In the secluded hills of Sisonville, West Virginia, surrounded by rustling trees and the deceptive quiet of rural life, a horror story was unfolding in plain sight. Behind a modest country home lived 5 black children adopted with the promise of love, safety, and a better future. But what they found instead was degradation, slavery, and suffering that would leave permanent scars. Their adoptive parents, Jean K. Whitefeather and Donald Lance, a white couple in their 60s, would go on to be convicted of unspeakable crimes: forced labor, civil rights violations, child neglect, and human trafficking. But the true horror of this case isn't just what they were charged with. It's what they did and how long it took for anyone to notice. In 2018, Whitefeather and Lance legally adopted 5 black children from out of state. To friends and neighbors, they presented themselves as altruistic, self-sacrificing individuals, an older white couple who had generously opened their home to disadvantaged children. But the reality was far from charitable. Authorities now believe the children were selected with calculated cruelty, chosen not out of love, but for manipulation, exploitation, and control. There was no intention of nurturing them. From the beginning, this was about power. Soon after their adoption, the children began to vanish from view. Neighbors reported rarely seeing them outside, and when they did, the children appeared anxious, dirty, and withdrawn. One neighbor noticed something strange. 2 of the children never seemed to go inside the house. Instead, they lingered around the yard, even in the cold and rain. Then came the call that broke the case open. The nightmare might have continued indefinitely had it not been for one concerned neighbor. In October 2023, a quiet phone call was made to Child Protective Services. The caller had grown increasingly disturbed by the sight, or rather, the absence of the children. 2 of the teens, aged 14 and 16, were rarely seen entering the house. When they were visible, they looked disheveled, sunken-eyed, thin, and often wandered around the property like ghosts with nowhere to go. Deputies responded. What they found would haunt them. Out back, behind the house, was a metal storage shed. It looked like a place to store tools, or maybe old junk. But when the door creaked open, the truth spilled out like rot. Inside, 2 teenage boys were being held prisoner. The shed was windowless, uninsulated, and dark as a tomb. There was no electricity, no running water, just a single filthy portable toilet, a few crumpled blankets, and bare concrete. The air smelled of urine and mildew. There was a damp chill that clung to the skin. The children had been kept in that shed for up to 12 hours a day, sometimes longer. Their punishment? Disobedience. Speaking out. Existing. They told officers they were forced to sleep on the cold ground, only allowed to eat scraps, and were regularly locked inside like animals. One child's feet were visibly infected and covered in sores. They had been forbidden from using the bathroom indoors and had to relieve themselves in a bucket or go without. The boys weren't allowed in the house. That was reserved for Jean and Donald. What followed in the courtroom was one of the most emotionally devastating trials West Virginia had ever seen. The children's testimonies, especially those of the eldest daughter, peeled back the mask of normalcy Whitefeather and Lance had worn for years. She described a house where the walls didn't echo with laughter, but with screams and insults. They were routinely cursed at, called lazy, dirty, and worthless. Their punishments were ritualistic and cruel, forced to stand for hours with their hands held above their heads, denied food, and isolated in silence. If they cried or resisted, the abuse worsened. Whitefeather, the matriarch, reportedly told one child they were lucky she adopted them, because no one else would want trash like you. Then came the voice of Judge Mary Claire Akers during sentencing. Her words weren't just legal, they were a condemnation of what the courtroom had come to understand. You brought these children to West Virginia, a place that I know is almost heaven, and you put them in hell. The silence that followed was heavier than steel. One of the children cried silently in the back row. A reporter had to step outside to gather herself. Even the court clerk reportedly had tears in her eyes. Judge Akers spoke directly to Whitefeather and Lance with chilling finality. You orchestrated a life of fear, pain, and degradation for children who depended on you. You were not caregivers, you were captors. And this court will not forget. The justice system responded with ironclad fury. Jean Whitefeather was sentenced to 215 years in prison, a sentence rarely seen, reserved for the most inhumane crimes. It symbolized more than time. It was an attempt to quantify the lifetime of trauma inflicted on her victims. Her crimes weren't just legal offenses, they were violations of humanity. Each year on her sentence, each charge represented a wound carved into the lives of the children she betrayed. Donald Lance, though not convicted on all the same counts, received 160 years behind bars. His defense attorney, John J. Belenovich, argued that Lance was not guilty of civil rights violations and that the truth was murkier than painted. But the jury didn't buy it. The children's words were too raw. Their pain was too real. It's worth noting, neither Whitefeather nor Lance showed remorse in court. No apologies, no breakdowns, no tears. It was as if they didn't see their victims as human at all. That cold detachment made the courtroom even more chilling. As the gavel fell, Whitefeather and Lance were led away not just to prison, but to an isolated oblivion, where they will rot alone, the screams of their victims never far behind. The most haunting question remains, how did this happen? For 5 years, they endured this abuse without intervention. No red flags were acted on. No welfare visits caught the warning signs. They were effectively disappeared inside a house in rural West Virginia while the system labeled them placed and moved on. No child should ever become invisible, but these children did. It raises painful questions about the racial dynamics of adoption, particularly involving Black children placed in white households, often in isolated communities. Who checks in? Who watches over them? Who ensures they're safe when no one's looking? For the 5 children rescued from Whitefeather and Lance, the road to healing will be long. Their lives have been permanently altered. But they are survivors, not just victims, and their courage has exposed a broken system that desperately needs reform. What happened on that property in Sisonville wasn't just abuse. It was a deliberate dehumanization, a stripping of identity, dignity, and autonomy. And it all happened in a quiet neighborhood, behind a normal house, while the world looked away. There are other sheds, other houses, other victims. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the racial dynamic. Prosecutors emphasized that the children weren't just abused, they were targeted because they were Black. The defense had no coherent rebuttal for the racial slurs used, the differential treatment, or the calculated dehumanization of these children. This wasn't just child abuse. It was racialized modern-day enslavement, a case of white adoptive parents using systemic loopholes to exploit and control vulnerable Black children. It struck a nerve nationwide and sparked questions about whether similar abuses are happening under the radar elsewhere. Though justice has now been served in court, the story is far from over. The children, now teenagers, will carry the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Recovery is possible, but healing from such cruelty is a long, uncertain road. And until we face that truth, we risk repeating this horror again and again. Thank you, my curious, eerie souls, for stepping once more into the darkness. My name is Penny Flick with Kreep-ish. Share your thoughts below. We're just scratching the surface of true crime, history's mysteries, and all things hauntingly fascinating. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and always remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones who call themselves parents.